world would have occurred. It's most, according to a lot of other ancient writings, and even the apocryphal book of 2nd Maccabees, oftentimes this would have occurred around the age of 3. So it's a little later than perhaps what is common today in our culture, but most children would have been weaned around 3 years old, and so she says, I would like to wean him until that point, and then she will bring him to be before the priests and at the tabernacle forever. Okay, so that's what she says, and in light of that, it should be noted that we just got done seeing at the very start that, and I just got done emphasizing that this is a family that very much prioritized the worship of the Lord, and yet here is Hannah kind of not going to the worship of the Lord for at least 3 years worth of time. And so we might wonder what that's all about. And so basically to that, it should be noted that in accordance with the law, it was actually only required that the men were the only ones who were officially mandated or required to make these annual trips to the tabernacle. There were 3 annual trips that were absolutely required by the men. It was Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths. All the men had to go to the tabernacle at these appointed times, and technically the women were not required in the same way as the men were. Now, usually when they did this, as we saw at the start of the chapter, the men would bring their wives and their children along with, so usually it was a whole family ordeal, but it was not technically required for the women to do it the same way as the men, and so all that to simply say, Hannah is actually not violating the law by staying home with Samuel to wean him for 3 years. Right? But in any case, that's what she decides to do, and ultimately we see that Elkanah agrees, such that he says, do what seems best to you. Which ultimately also indicates that he has agreed with her vow as well. Because in the law, in Numbers chapter 30, verse 10, we're told that if a wife actually made a vow while not in the presence of her husband, that when the husband did hear about it, he had the authority to cancel the vow if he wanted to. And so in Hannah's case, we saw that she made this vow to give Samuel to the Lord in the context of her own private prayer, but inevitably she would have told Elkanah about it. And at the moment that Elkanah heard this vow, again, he could have, if he wanted to, just put a stop to it and said, no, we're not going to do that. But he doesn't do that. He agrees with her vow, and he says, do what seems best to you. So he's in agreement with it, but then he does add, only, he says, may the Lord establish his word. And now when it says establish his word here, the actual word his, interestingly, isn't in the actual Hebrew manuscripts, and so it's more literally just may the word be established. Right? But in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which Jesus and the apostles quote from, highlighting its legitimacy, it actually says your word here. So may the Lord establish your word, as in he's talking to Hannah, so may Hannah's word be established. So basically what it's saying is that Elkanah is confirming Hannah's vow to offer Samuel to the Lord. He agrees that they will wait until he's around 3 years old and fully weaned, but then he says, you're going to have to establish your word, Hannah. Right? So he's basically preparing her, like, you're going to have to keep your word. This is the vow you've made, so you're going to have to do it. It's going to be hard to do it after 3 years of nurturing him and caring for him, but you're going to have to do this. And so he's basically getting her ready to just get ready for that. Which brings us to verse 20, halfway through 23 to 25. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with the 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the child to Eli. All right, so here now we see that after Hannah has in fact nursed and finished weaning Samuel around 3 years old, she then keeps her word, she goes to the tabernacle, and then presents Samuel before the priest Eli. So she is in fact doing what she said she was going to do. Now as she does so, notice in verse 24 that she offers a handful of sacrifices in accompaniment with offering Samuel to the priest. And this is also all in accordance with the law. So for instance, in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 8 through 10, we're told that when you offer a bull as a burnt offering or sacrifice to fulfill a vow or for a peace offering to the Lord, then one shall offer with the bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with half a hin of oil, and you shall offer for the drink offering half a hin of wine as a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Right? So, in accordance with the law, if you made a vow to the Lord, and you fulfilled that vow, and it's officially complete, it says, once you've fulfilled it, you were to then accompany it with certain sacrifices. Namely, a bull, it says, along with a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour, and a drink offering, half a hin of wine. So if you fulfill a vow, you're to bring a bull, flour, and wine to offer as a sacrifice unto the Lord at the tabernacle. And sure enough, going back to our text, when Hannah is now officially fulfilling this vow and offering Samuel, this is precisely what she is offering. A bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. Which is thus highlighting that she is doing things, once again, in accordance with the law. Right? Now, with that said, it is, notice when it says it is a 3-year-old bull that she is offering. Right? That's what it says here in the ESV translation. However, some translations will say that it was 3 bulls, or 3 bullocks. Right? So some say there was 3 bulls, others like this say it was a 3-year-old bull. Now the reason for the discrepancy is actually that in the Hebrew manuscripts, a lot of them say that it was 3 bulls, but again in the Septuagint, it actually interestingly says that it was a 3-year-old bull, and so it has both of these. And so, obviously, there's some discrepancy there. Now, in verse 25, it'll make reference to the bull, singular, getting sacrificed, which again would seem to perhaps indicate that there was only one and it was 3 years old. But then those who would say, who would argue that there's actually 3 bulls, they would say that, okay, so there's only one that's actually being offered, and the other 2 were perhaps just simply brought as gifts to the priest or to the tabernacle, or were used for some other purpose. So there still could have been 3. That's what they would say. So ultimately, whether it was a 3-year-old bull or 3 bulls that were brought at this time, the actual significant thing to note is the number 3 in accordance with it. Because, if you remember, Samuel would have been around 3 years old when he was offered, and now there's a 3-year-old bull being offered, or perhaps 3 bulls. And ephah of fine flour was actually 3 times the amount that was supposed to be offered when you fulfilled a vow. We saw in Numbers that you were supposed to give 3/10 of an ephah when you fulfilled a vow. Now she's provided a full ephah, which would again be just a little over 3 times the amount. And so what commentators point out here is that what Hannah may in fact be doing is that she's basically making up for the 3 years that she perhaps missed coming to the tabernacle. She's offering 3 times the amount that would be required for the 3 years that she missed. Which would again highlight that Hannah really does take the worship of the Lord seriously. She's not just, making things up as she goes. She's not just worshiping the Lord, again, in accordance with what seems right in her own eyes, just kind of like, well, this seems like it would be a nice thing, but rather she knows what the law says to do, and that's what then she is, in fact, doing, which is very commendable, right? And again, it serves as a very stark contrast with what we're going to see from Hophni and Phinehas in the middle of chapter 2, who are not worshiping the Lord in accordance with the law at all. They're completely making things up, as we're going to see. So that's, again, a stark contrast from them. She's worshiping the Lord. She's doing exactly as the Lord said to do it. And so, as she now has gone to the tabernacle, fulfilling the vow, fulfilling the law in accordance with vow offerings, and then it says in verse 26 to the end of the chapter, she said, "O my Lord," and she's talking to Eli, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted to me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord," and he worshipped the Lord there. All right, so here now, in conclusion of chapter 1, again, it begins simply that Hannah, she's before Eli the priest, she's presenting Samuel. She begins simply by reminding Eli that she was actually the woman who had been praying there 3 years previously for this child, and that Eli had actually confirmed was going to have a child. Eli initially mistook her as a drunken woman, if you remember, but then she explained the situation, and he then blessed her. Right, now, I think it's interesting also to note that Hannah doesn't actually bring that part up, though. So she's not highlighting the fact that he had mistaken her as a drunken woman. Like, you thought I was drunk, and here I am now, and I'm doing all of this. So she doesn't do that. She doesn't, lord it over him that he messed up on that occasion. She's, again, all the indications we get is that she's too respectful for that. She's being a good woman here. And ultimately, though, she does remind him of the fact that she was the one who had been praying for this. And again, that only happened about 14 verses ago for us, so it's still pretty fresh in our minds. But this was about, chronologically, 3 years later. And so, again, that would be like somebody reminding you of a conversation you had with them back in February of 2021. Which, again, when they do that, you might recall it, it might ring a bell, but if they had not reminded you, you might have forgotten about the conversation itself. So that's basically what Hannah is doing here on this occasion. She reminds him of it, and then she says that the Lord has, in fact, granted her petition for the child. He answered the prayer, and therefore, she says, she is now fulfilling her vow to lend him to the Lord all the days of his life. Okay? So very simply, she is keeping her word. She's brought the child. She's doing what she said she was going to do. And that's where the chapter then comes to a close. Now, before we summarize and then apply, though, there is actually one other observation I want to make in connection to all of this. And it's actually a literary observation. And it's actually one that we started actually making last week. Okay? So, for instance, in verse 17, which we looked at last week, this was when Eli, again, and Hannah was praying. He thought she was a drunken woman. She corrects him, or she explains the situation. He then understands, and it says that Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." Okay, so that's what he says. And I simply want to note that when it says, he says, "May the Lord grant your petition," that word in Hebrew is the word she'elah, which literally means a thing asked for. Which is why it's translated as petition, because that's what a petition is. So it's a fine enough translation. But then, the very next phrase, when he says that you have made to him, is a very similar Hebrew word, sha'al, which is from the same root word as she'elah, and it means, again, to ask. So he's using two very similar words, and so more literally it's saying, may the God of Israel give you the asking which you have asked of him. Okay? Now, that may explain then why in verse 20, when she finally has Samuel, she then said that ultimately the Lord, she's named him Samuel because I have asked for him from the Lord. So she again uses the same language, right? And we noted that what's interesting about that is that the name Samuel doesn't actually mean, though, asked of the Lord, which would seem to be the indication. She named him Samuel because I've asked of him. But Samuel doesn't mean that. It means name of God, literally. And the name asked of the Lord is actually the name, if you remember, was Saul. Which is interesting because Saul, again, plays a very prominent figure in 1 Samuel as the first king of Israel, the one that all the people asked for. Right? So from this, we argue that this could be a bit of foreshadowing at the very start that Samuel is the true Saul in that sense. He was the one that the people should have been asking for, but they don't, and they instead sinfully ask for a different king like all the other nations. And thus, right, and thus God gave them Saul, right? Now, the reason I bring all of that up again is because here at the end of our text, in verse 27 and 28, which we looked at, all of this is again being very much emphasized. Such that Hannah, when she said that the Lord has granted her petition, it's the same exact Hebrew word, she'elah, that Eli used back in verse 17, a thing asked for. And when she says that she had made to him, again, same Hebrew word that Eli used, sha'al, to ask. But it doesn't stop there. In verse 28, when she says that I have lent him to the Lord, as long as he lives, he has lent to the Lord. She says it twice in verse 28, and it's actually the same exact Hebrew word as made to, that she just made a second ago. It's the word sha'al. Right? So, again, we don't see it in English as clearly, but in Hebrew, it would be very obvious that Hannah is now using the same word over and over and over again to describe this situation. Such that, as commentators point out, if we were to translate verse 27 and 28 a little bit more literally, it would say, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord gave me my asking, which I asked of him. And I also have given back what was asked to the Lord. All the days he lives, he is the one asked for the Lord." Right? So again, it doesn't flow quite as smoothly in English, but that's literally what is being communicated here in Hebrew. And thus, chapter 1 is being very emphatic verse 17, verse 20, verse 25, 27, 28, multiple times in all of those verses, that Samuel is the one that was asked of the Lord. He's the one that Hannah asked for, he's the one that the Lord gave, and so he, in this sense, serves as the true Saul, the true one that was asked of. But instead, again, people are going to sinfully ask for a different king like all the other nations, and then God will give them the one they asked for. He's going to give them a Saul. And that's going to turn out to be troublesome for them in many respects, as we'll go on to see. And so again, I simply point all of that out is that this is a bit of foreshadowing at the very start of the book of what is now about to happen in the chapters that follow. But with all that said, that concludes chapter 1. And so, by way of summary in our text today, what we see very simply is that Hannah keeps Samuel until he is fully weaned at around the age of 3. And then afterwards, it says that she then brings him to the tabernacle and dedicates or lends him to the Lord all the days of his life, thus fulfilling the vow that she made back in verse 11. Right? Very simply, that's what is transpiring in our passage for today. And thus, as we now transition, lastly, into our point of application as to how do we then, what do we do with a text like this in our modern context today as Christians in the 21st century? The answer to that, what I would simply commend to us, is to simply hone in on the very straightforward summary that we just seen. It's namely, Hannah made a vow, she made a promise to do something, and then she did it. She made a promise, and then she fulfilled that promise. She said she was going to do something, dedicate Samuel. She then fulfilled that vow after weaning him for 3 years, and she then kept the law as it pertains to the sacrifices. She offered the bull, the flour, and the wine. And so she's keeping the law, as we see in Numbers 30, verse 2. It said that if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Or, as it said later in Deuteronomy 23:21, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. So this is what the law required, and this is exactly what we see Hannah do. She did not, it says, break her word. She did not ultimately delay in fulfilling it. She waited till he was 3, but she didn't then perpetually delay it. Like, well, let's just keep him another year, and then another year, and then another year, and then eventually say, well, let's just not do it at all. No, but she didn't delay ultimately in fulfilling it, but rather she is doing according to all that proceeded out of her mouth. Super basic, super obvious, but it is nevertheless, it serves as a blessed, positive example of how we then ought to conduct ourselves as Christians today. And so again, the application I commend to us in light of what we see here is that, as Christians, let us be men and women who keep our word. Super simple, super basic. I know this is something that we all already know, theoretically in our mind, but I will exhort us in it nevertheless. That we would strive to be Christians who do what we say we're going to do, even when, inevitably, it becomes costly or inconvenient at times to actually fulfill what we said we're going to do. Even if, theoretically, no one else is actually keeping their word in their particular situation, that we would still keep our word. And even when we perhaps no longer feel motivated to do what we said we were going to do, let us be the type of people who will nevertheless keep our word and do that which we said we're going to do. As it says in Psalm 15, this interesting, it's a short little psalm, and it basically says that those who will be in the tent of the Lord, those who will ascend to the holy hill of the Lord are, amongst other things, it lists some things that characterize those who will be in the presence of the Lord. But one of them, in Psalm 15:4, is that those who swear to their own hurt and they do not change. Right? God's blessing is upon us when, if we say we're going to do something, we swear, we make a promise, we give our word, we're going to do this, and then we don't change it. We don't just simply, okay, a little time goes by and we say, actually, never mind, I'm not going to do that anymore, and we just negate it as if it never existed in the first place. We keep our word, we don't change, even when it says it hurts to do so. Which I think is very realistic. Because again, inevitably, there's going to be times in your life where you say you're going to do something, you make some sort of commitment, because in the moment, you were motivated to do that very thing. But over the course of time, some of that motivation begins to wane, you're not as zealous to keep your word any longer, and so basically, you're going to be tempted in those moments to just not keep your word any longer, to just break your oath And Psalm 15 is saying that the righteous person ultimately won't do that. They will keep their word even when it hurts to do so. And so again, that is what I am exhorting us as Christians, that we should be marked by the same thing, which will then exhibit itself in a plethora of different ways in the course of our life, and all of the interactions that we have. But just a couple of examples. In our marriage, right? We've taken marriage vows, and it's part of the ceremony itself, such that the very common marriage vows that are taken is that we will be faithful and stay with our spouse for better or worse, richer or poor, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. These are the vows, these are the promises we make, and thus, therefore, in marriage, the very concept of divorce should never even be on the table. It should never even be an option that we consider, even for a moment. Because oftentimes it's the thought of, unfortunately, there's this idea of, we'll do these things until I don't feel like it anymore, until that sense of love and romance that we had at the start isn't there anymore, or until maybe they did something to us, or they broke the vow at some point. Right? And see, oftentimes these are considered to be like, well, therefore, I can get a divorce. Therefore, I don't have to keep my word anymore. But the vows actually preclude that. The vows actually say, for better or worse. Right? It literally accounts for the fact that there's going to be times where it seems like it's worse. It accounts for the times when you're going rich or when you're poor. When you're healthy or when you're sick. Right? It accounts for all of these things. That therefore, you will keep your word and you will be faithful with one another. And so these are things that we should understand. Another example is even in church membership. As members of the church, we have taken vows to then be invested and involved and present and generous with what God has blessed us with, to then be a blessing to the church and to the congregation, so as to advance the kingdom of God where we are. These are the vows that we make, and therefore we should be guarding our hearts from kind of always being perpetually sort of at arm's length from the rest of the congregation, which is sometimes a temptation. Like, we're kind of just always aloof, you're not ever truly invested, very sporadic in your involvement or in your participation or in your whatever. Like, this is a temptation that we will often feel, but this again is completely contrary to the vows that we make as churchmen and churchwomen. And then again, you can just fill in all of the plethora of blanks that you can possibly do. And all of the promises that you make, again, to your spouse, to your children, to your friends, to your co-workers, to whoever it is, we should be marked by people who then actually fulfill those commitments and do what we say we're going to do. And we should be very much guarding our hearts from being the flaky, unreliable person who does not fulfill their promises. Like, that person exists, and I'm exhorting us, don't be that person. Right? Don't be that person in the story where they say, yeah, I'll do that, I'll be there, I'll make this, I'll do that. And then the time comes, you're like, where are they? I thought they said they were going to be there, I thought they said they were going to help. Don't be that person who then just kind of flakes on the whole situation. And lastly, one last exhortation is, don't be pharisaical in your oaths and your promises. And what I mean by that is, as Christians, like, we kind of know that we should keep our word, we know that we should do things. But what we will often then do is we will try to find religious-sounding reasons for why we don't have to actually keep our word. And this is something that the Pharisees did, as we learn actually over in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus actually addresses this very thing. In the Sermon on the Mount, it's a significant enough issue to actually make his Sermon on the Mount manuscript, as it were. And he says, chapter 5, verse 33 through 37, he says, "Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." All right. So, here, Jesus makes a very strong exhortation, and from it actually, many people have concluded that Christians really shouldn't take any sort of oath or vow or make any sort of promise at all in our day-to-day, because Jesus seems to be saying, do not take oaths at all. So he seems like he's just given a complete blanket statement, never make a vow ever. But that's actually not what Jesus is saying here, because later in the book of Acts, chapter 18 and 21, we will see the Apostle Paul and then 4 other unnamed Christians taking vows to do certain things. So the very idea of taking vows, making oaths, is not just a pure, off-limits wholesale, but rather what Jesus is actually condemning here is something contextually that was going on in his time, particularly with the Pharisees, such that it was very common for the rabbis of his day they basically wanted to try to keep the law, but they also understood that, to do so, they sometimes had to make these loopholes in order to get around certain things. So what they basically said is, if you make a vow, it's only officially binding if you invoke God's name. So if you say, I swear by God, or I swear by Yahweh, then it would be binding and you have to do it. But you could make oaths in the name of other things, and it would be technically well, that's good, but it wasn't actually binding. So basically what was very common, Jesus points out a handful of these instances. People would say, I swear by heaven that I'll do this, or I swear by the earth, or I swear by the holy city Jerusalem, or I swear by my head that I will do this or that. But if they did not actually invoke the name of God, then they could actually change their mind later and not be in violation of Numbers or Deuteronomy, which says that you had to keep your vow. So it was just basically a system. They concocted this system of, technically being able to get out of vows that they had previously made, while still sounding very pious and, religious in the process. And this is particularly what Jesus is condemning here. He is condemning the rabbis' faulty system of using wordplay to technically go back on what they had promised to do. And therefore, Jesus then says, simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. What you say you're going to do, that's what you should do. And you shouldn't think, well, technically, I didn't say in the name of God, though, so technically I don't have to do that. No, he says, if you said you're going to do it, that's what you're going to do. If you said you're not, that's binding. That's what you should be doing. Right? And it's that type of thing, therefore, that I'm exhorting us as well this morning. That we should be men and women of our word. The things we say we're going to do, we should commit to that. The commitments that we make, we should stick to it. And we should guard our hearts from being flaky, inconsistent, unreliable, and pharisaical in our tendency to find loopholes so as not to do it. Well, technically I said that, but if you think about it, I didn't actually say, this is a tendency that we can sometimes do to find technicalities to get out of what we said we're actually going to do. So Jesus says, don't do that, right? God knows what you meant by it, and so do what you had meant. And so trust Him, keep your word, teach this to your children to do the same exact thing, and so advance the kingdom and honor Christ. Let's pray. Father God, we do thank you and we praise you for blessing us with this opportunity to gather today once again. And we ask for this blessing, in light of everything we just looked at, to accompany us and to then be the way we live in accordance with others as Christians, that we would be people of our word. And Lord, we ask even at this moment that you would forgive us of all the times in which we have not kept our word, for the times in which we have been flaky or inconsistent or unreliable, the times where we have played word games to get out of things that we actually know we really did commit to, but we just look for technicalities. Lord, help us, guard us from that, Lord. Please forgive us of the times when we've been guilty of it. And we ask that you would give us then the conviction and the integrity to be people of our word, so as to then honor you and to glorify you in everything that we do. Lord, you alone have the power and the authority to grant to us this good gift. Apart from you, God, we cannot accomplish this thing. And so we're coming before you that you would apply this gift to every single one of us here. We ask in the good name of Jesus. Amen. And so for the charge for this morning is that the Lord God, in His infinite mercy, right after the fall of mankind in Genesis 3, if you remember, He promised, still in Genesis 3, that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And sure enough, thousands of years later, after many ups and downs, God kept His word and sent His Son, Jesus Christ. And as we just got done singing, God did not spare His own Son, but sent Him to die, to bear our burden, and to take away our sin. And therefore, in light of this great salvation that God has accomplished, and because He kept His word and fulfilled it, let us likewise then be men and women of our word, doing that which we have promised and committed ourselves to do, to the advancement of the kingdom and to the glory of Christ. Now for the benediction. Now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy, to the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority, before all time, and now and forever. Amen.